Hello, today I am re-reviewing the Zaunkoenig M2K. I want to revisit this mouse on the channel because some of my thoughts have changed over time and my opinions have matured a little bit. When I first covered it, it was my main at the time. I'd used it almost exclusively for nearly a month, and at the time I didn't see anything overtaking it. It felt that good. But after that video, I started to revisit some other mice that were my old favorites to review them, and I rediscovered what I liked about those. And I also picked up some new stuff, so I was just bouncing around a lot in general. Then, late 2021 brought some mice that are near perfect for me, like the S2C, Z13C, and G33 Shroud Edition. So, very quickly after reviewing it, I dropped the M2K almost entirely. And not even because I started to dislike the mouse, really. I've always heavily enjoyed my time with it. It's just that some other stuff had come in and taken my attention, which never really felt fair to it. So, for the past month, I've been back on the M2K and been swapping around between my main rotation and this to try to get a better idea of where it sits for me amongst a market stacked with great options. And also to just collect my thoughts so that I can better articulate what really makes the M2K tick and what it offers over other mice. Alright, let's get into it. Where I want to start here is with a quick overview of the M2K's general features, because nothing about this mouse is quite standard. Firstly, its claim to fame is that it is a full-featured mouse with 2 buttons plus a fully functioning scroll wheel, but at only 24 grams, the lightest in the world. This is done through using a carbon fiber shell, a completely unique material that is very lightweight but difficult to work with and mass produce, and a ludicrous amount of over-engineering from the two brothers that designed and manufactured these mice. Now, I say it's over-engineered, but that honestly doesn't begin to describe the obvious work that went into this mouse because every detail is simply flawless. From the hand-laid carbon fiber shell that's fused into one piece without air and is completely sturdy despite how it may seem, plus also quite grippy on the sandblasted version, since the added texture from the carbon fiber weave that gets exposed actually feels more like grip tape than a traditional mouse coating. Next to these Japanese arm-ons that are implemented well to give a very satisfyingly snappy and sharp-feeling tactile response that also pairs quite well with the carbon fiber shell to give it a little bit of a bassy resonance that the whole body, which is pretty unique. Normally, you only feel the tactile response in the actual main buttons themselves, but on the M2K, you can actually feel it go down all the way through the sides, which is quite nice and just feels very premium. Then, especially to the design of their scroll wheel, that feels very satisfying to the touch due to their ceramic coating and these nice little bumps to help grab your finger, and a scroll action that is highly tactile with a very satisfying feeling of bounciness, but that is also light enough to use that it's not annoying, and all while retaining the feather-light weight. Plus, the middle click is incredibly satisfying and legitimately as good as some other M1s. And then finally, all the way down to the feet, which are actually just custom core pads, which are the industry standard. So the glide is smooth and fast, but it still retains the texture of Rust mouse pads to help give you the tactility that you really need to help control such an impossibly light mouse. So, everything about this mouse is thoughtfully designed and perfectly implemented. Well, except for the cable actually, because that part is legitimately trash. It is so bad that it brings down the whole otherwise perfect experience. It is rubber coated, so it is relatively inflexible, and you can feel the cable flex and tug slightly on the mouse whenever you move it. And on such a light mouse, this is actually a big deal because it is far more noticeable than it would usually be. On a heavier mouse, even something around like 60 grams, which is still pretty lightweight, it'd likely be fine because it holds its shape so you actually never run it over with poor management, and the rubber doesn't actually create that much pad drag like you may expect. It's very slippery. But with a mouse like the M2K, you will always have to fight the cable just a little bit. Of course though, you can get used to it, and I do personally stop noticing it after a little while. But it is undeniable how much better it would be with a better cord, because that is really the only fault. Everything else feels perfect and completely effortless to use, except this very bad cable. Alright, now I want to go over the shape somewhat quickly because it is actually far less interesting on this mouse, because it's mostly just a box with not really much going on, and it is designed solely for fingertips, so very little of your hand actually touches, and thus the shape is far less relevant for this grip style in general. Although it does do some pretty interesting things though, namely it is very short, so you are completely unrestricted and you will only ever make palm contact with an absolutely ungodly amount of finger curl, so you are basically completely unrestricted. Then it is also quite wide, for reference, almost about as wide as the GPX at the very middle point. So it is actually fairly comfortable and feels a little bit bigger and bulkier than it looks, which means that most people should be able to adapt to it without significant issue, and you probably won't experience very severe hand cramps, like you may expect from such a small looking mouse. The sides are also pretty V-shaped to help follow your fingers throughout the full vertical range of motion of fingertip and make it feel a little bit more comfortable. This may seem pretty small, but it actually makes a big difference when it comes to making consistent contact during these extreme movements. This is a very underrated part of this design, and I feel it is one of the big things that makes this mouse so comfortable for pure fingertip. Now finally, it is also fairly wedge-shaped, so your fingers do get pretty low to the pad and you get a nice feeling of precision because of it. Just be aware that it may be a little bit awkward at first to have such a low buttons on a very wide and short mouse. Personally, I got used to it pretty quickly, but it is super unique and pretty preferential. It gives it a almost somewhat aggressive feel, which may be a little strange for a relaxed fingertip, which would be a pretty common grip style on such a boxy, flat mouse. So now, all things considered, we have to talk about the value. Is this mouse worth the €300 asking price? No, absolutely not. There's simply no possible way for any mouse to ever be worth €300, because at the end of the day, it is still just a mouse. I do think that it does operate quite differently from anything else on the market, and it does perform very well for me personally. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but it still does essentially the same thing as any other mouse. Instead, what you're paying for is an engineering sample of what you can do when you push a mouse design to the absolute extreme, and in that regard, it actually lives up to the price, I think. I have never been so impressed by the quality of the mouse before, and as someone who likes using a lot of different mice just for the sake of it, the M2K's ability to offer a completely unique experience adds a lot of value in itself. So for me personally, it was worth it. I've gotten a lot of use out of it, and I enjoy it for what it is. That is the most unique mouse out there, not necessarily the king of performance. But if you're not like me and you just want to play games and you don't necessarily like collecting mice and just trying them out for the sake of trying them out, don't get it. This is a peripheral enthusiast product if there ever was one. It would almost be hard to even appreciate what this mouse does differently if you're not already neck deep down the rabbit hole. Alright, now that I got that out of the way, we can move on to the most important part. That is my personal performance. Overall, this has easily been one of my top performing mice. My peaks are certainly the highest on this mouse, and I consistently feel like that what I can do with this mouse cannot be replicated on a different setup. It is that uniquely high performing that I can feel it pushing my ceiling beyond what I thought it could be. Which does make sense, because on paper, this should be the highest performing mouse, mainly because the low weight gives it extremely low inertia, which means that it does require the least force to accelerate out of any mouse. So it is very easy to get it moving from a standstill, which gives it a uniquely snappy and fast feeling that is strangely responsive. It's almost like the mouse moves as you think about it, and every other mouse in comparison starts to feel like it has the tiniest bit of delay from when you want to move the mouse to when your cursor actually starts moving in the game, which is a really cool feeling that I quite enjoy. It's really excellent. Your flicks overall feel significantly faster without even trying because it is so snappy. And faster to accelerate also means faster to decelerate as well. So it still does stop on a dime to make pure click timing feel fantastic and quite easy actually, because it is so effortless to both start and stop a flick. And low inertia also makes it easier to change acceleration. So as you're tracking, it requires less force to adjust the path you're taking to smooth track a target as it moves non-linearly, like in an arc for example, and it also requires less force to completely stop and change direction, which makes reactively tracking a strafing target far more effortless feeling. So because of that, this mouse is pretty easily the best at in-game large angle tracking for me personally. It is highly consistent and just so easy for this specific application, and it is all purely because of how light it is. Here is where I most feel the benefit of using a mouse of this weight. And all in all, this low weight also gives the M2K a uniquely fluid feeling that is truly excellent in game and my favorite part about it. It is just so buttery smooth that it becomes highly intuitive to aim with. It's almost like you're not even using a mouse at all. Instead, there's just a sensor in the middle of your hand, and you just have to use your arm to aim instead of manipulating a mouse. This is great because it allows you to focus much more on the other aspects that go into playing well when your mouse control is so second nature. They can start to focus on these much more important aspects. So, while the M2K does have a lot going for it performance-wise, the actual objective improvement is far less than you might expect, and I do feel that there are heavily diminishing returns when you do start to get this light. For reference here, the GPX to the outset AX is a very noticeable jump in weight. The GPX is almost 20 grams lighter at 63 as opposed to 80 plus grams. And to me, I do feel like there is an objective improvement here, where the GPX is faster and easier to control by a good margin that is impossible to ignore. So differences like these, from lightweight to more I would call at the heavy end of medium weight, you do start to see great gains that you can immediately notice. But when you start to compare the GPX to the M2K, lightweight to featherweight, the difference actually feels pretty similar, despite being an almost 40 gram difference, nearly twice the GPX to the outset. So when you start to think more practically, it's actually much less spectacular. There is still a very noticeable difference here, don't get me wrong. The M2K does feel far more nimble than the GPX, it's just not quite mind-blowing, and the differences here are surprisingly marginal. And a mouse this lightweight starts to have genuine downsides to it, because inertia this low is always going to be a double-edged sword. It does allow for that uniquely responsive feel I was talking about, and that performance is undeniable, but it also has the quality of amplifying natural errors. For example, with a heavier mouse like the Outside here, when you want to move it in a straight line, it is very smooth and consistent because the extra inertia helps keep this mouse on its current trajectory and acceleration and resist the force of some of the jitters that your hand may make. But with the M2K, since it does have so much less mass, you have a much weaker resisting force, so more of these jitters end up affecting the mouse's actual movement, which makes it much harder to be smooth and consistent. So I don't actually enjoy this mouse much for slower paced games like tack shooters, where steady crosshair placement and smooth, clean lines are critical to performing well. Of course, it is still usable in these applications. There are just better options for me personally, and I feel that for most people this will not be optimal for these types of games. Although you can still achieve smoothness, and my experiences with aim training on this mouse have been very fruitful for improving my pure fundamentals. But we are all still human and make errors, even the best of us. And the M2K's low weight amplifies these errors and is just inherently less consistent because of it, which is a big deal for tack shooters. But for fast-paced games, it's totally fine because they're just a lot more forgiving, and generally stability and just consistency is less of an issue. There's just simply more wiggle room and more opportunities for the raw mouse control and responsiveness to overcome some of these downsides. That's why that even though this mouse does have my highest peaks, it actually feels about even with my other top options, the Z13C and G33 Shroud Edition, because these frequent moments of inconsistency and its inability to be viable for slower paced games for me personally brings this mouse back down to earth a lot and pulls it more in line with other options. And even when you do consider the peaks that this mouse can offer, they're still not that much higher than anything else. It's only a couple percent better. And really, the difference between any two mice will only ever be a fairly marginal improvement. For example, the FK2 was a mouse that I did not like or really play well on initially, but I stuck with it for over a month and I was eventually able to get back up to the same level of comfort as my main mouse after I adjusted to it and learned a new grip style. And if anything, I actually started to play a little bit better since I committed to one setup for an extended period of time and stopped thinking so much about swapping it around. So if you put in the time, you can definitely adapt to and play well on just about anything, and mouse choice stops mattering much at all, unless there are more severe issues like pain. But even though I was able to fully adapt to and eventually play well with the FK2, I swapped off it almost immediately after reviewing it for the large hump mice I prefer, like the S2, Z13, G33 SE, and even the GPX, and I never turned back. This mouse has stayed in my drawer since. Because at the end of the day, the entire point of experimenting with different mice is to explore unique options and experiences, and most importantly, really dive into finding out what you are the most comfortable with personally, and chasing the mouse that feels the best for you. And for me, the M2K feels good. That fluidity and effortless I was talking about is incredible and highly unique. So it is easily one of my top options off of that alone. It has that something special to make me feel confident, and it's just enjoyable to use. The G33 SE and Z13C are still my two mains and the mice that I am the most comfortable with by far, because I can still use my main claw grip style with them, and they do have less downsides and are just overall more consistent in comparison. But the M2K does offer a nice change of pace, so I will continue to use it alongside these mice, and I don't see myself dropping it like I did last time, or at least until something even more interesting comes out. But until that day, these three mice will likely be my top options. Alright, thank you all for watching. There hasn't been much content lately, but I do have a couple of videos lined up for the next 2 weeks. Firstly, I'm going to be covering core pad grips and Lethal Skates V2 on the G33 SE. I definitely have been sleeping on mouse grips, and these updated glass skates do feel better. Next, the Esports Tiger Woogie 2 is actually my new main mousepad. It feels incredible, so I am super looking forward to covering this. It feels so good. And I've had the Fnatic Bolt for a couple of days, so a review is coming soon for that as well. Then I also have the other Lethal Gaming Gear pads, and I'm probably going to do a couple pad roundups too. So more content is coming. Sorry for the hiatus. I hope to see you all in those ones.